Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Give people time to join the webinar this morning. We'll give folks just a moment to join and then we'll get started. I think I'll get started and we'll welcome others as they join in. I know for some this is quite early in the morning, others it's very late at night. So thank you for joining us for today's event, the International Arms Trade in a Time of Global Upheaval. I'm Rachel Stoll, Vice President of the Stimson Center and Director of its Conventional Defense Program. And I'm really delighted to be moderating this conversation today and welcome all of you to our conversation. For those of you who may not know, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, is among the world's foremost authorities on arms transfer dynamics. And SIPRI's Arms Transfers Database, which is by far the most comprehensive publicly available source for information on international arms transfers, was just updated on Monday to include updated data on arms transfers from 1950 all the way through 2022. So I'm deeply grateful that today, for the 8th consecutive year, Stimson is able to co-host this event with SIPRI to dig into their latest data, discuss how the tumultuous events of the past year have impacted global arms trade dynamics, and consider the implications of these recent arms transfer and the trends that they have resulted in may have in the years ahead. We're very fortunate today to welcome Peter Wesemann, Senior Researcher with SIPRI's Arms Transfers Program, who's going to walk us through some of the key takeaways from SIPRI's latest arms transfer data. And I'm also pleased to welcome Joe Gould, Associate Editor of Defense News, who will help us examine the interrelation between global arms trade dynamics and world events. And I'm equally pleased to be joined by Mary Lee Pullett, International Affairs Director at the Aerospace Industries Association, who will highlight the impact of world events on the defense industry. We'll, of course, reserve time at the end of our discussion to answer questions from the audience. I'm going to remind you that there's a Q&A function on your Zoom webinar that you can put your questions in as they come to you. You don't have to wait until the end, but I promise we will get to as many of them as we can. Before I turn it over to our panelists, I do want to take a few minutes to set the stage a little bit. Why are we hosting this event for the 8th year in a row? And I imagine that the war in Ukraine is really an issue at top of mind for many of you in the audience, as well as for myself, and for very good reason. If you tuned into our event with SIPRI at this time last year, and you can find it on the Stimson website if you want to go back and see how accurate we were in our theorizing. Last year when we held this event, it was just a few weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And you might remember me speculating at the time that given the extraordinary torrent of new arms transfers to Ukraine, even in those first few weeks, the scale and the pace of global efforts to shore up Ukraine's defenses may well be unprecedented. And today we really don't have to speculate. We know that based on our analysis, arms flows to Ukraine over the past year and SIPRI's new transfer data, we can say with certainty that the war in Ukraine has been really transformational for the arms trade. US security assistance to just Ukraine since Russia's February 2022 invasion has broken all modern precedents. In that time, the US has provided a staggering $32.2 billion in military assistance to Kiev, by far the largest amount the United States has ever provided to a country in a single year since at least the end of the Cold War. We've also seen large upticks in transfers to Ukraine from many European states, including Poland, Germany, and the UK. And as a result of this massive influx of arms, Ukraine, which previously had been a relatively minor weapons importer suddenly became one of the world's largest arms importers of 2022. And I think, as Peter is going to share with us, the war in Ukraine has had more wide-ranging impacts. Other European states have increased their demand for arms imports following Russia's invasion. And at the same time, we have Russia, which has relied almost exclusively on domestically produced weapons to sustain its assault on Ukraine, has actually seen a decline in arms exports since the war began. So as we discussed today, I'm really interested in utilizing some of SIPRI's latest data to really delve into how the conflict in Ukraine has influenced arms trade dynamics, not only in the United States, but obviously around the world. But Ukraine isn't the only thing on our mind. At the same time, I'm really eager to unpack the myriad other factors shaping global demand and first supply of arms as the war in Ukraine has raged on. We've seen tensions grow between the US and China. Countries continue to compete for influence in Africa, and the world really does continue to grapple with the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, all of which have significant impacts on the global arms trade. Finally, I really hope that this discussion is going to give us a chance to also look ahead, both to consider what we can expect from recent arms transfers trends, whether they're going to continue or not in the coming years, as well as some of the long-term trends that all of these transfers may pose, both to Ukraine and beyond. So I'll certainly be curious to hear how our speakers feel an accelerated global arms trade may impact the illicit arms market, as well as efforts to safeguard against diversion for weapons that have long shelf lives and pose risks for many years to come, or how the war in Ukraine is sort of reshaping our perceptions of the defense industrial needs, the pace of military production to meet 21st century demands. So I think we're going to have a very rich and interesting conversation today. As a reminder, this is a public, on-the-record event. It is being recorded. This recording will be available for later viewing, for sharing with your colleagues, and will be on the Stimson website. As I said, we're very keen to have this be a very interactive event. So I welcome you at any time to put your Q&A or your questions in the Q&A, and our speakers after their brief presentations will be available to answer questions. And with that, I'm very delighted to welcome our first presenter, Peter. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this introduction, and of course also for once again organizing this particular meeting, which reaches a US but also a global audience. We're very grateful from SIPRI's side for all the work you have put into this. I'm going to present to you some of the basic data, some of the basic trends and patterns that we have seen at SIPRI over the past few years. And I'm going to do that with the help of some slides, which I will put behind me right now, if I succeed in doing that now. And this takes a short moment, and there we are. This picture shows to you the long-term trend in international transfers of major arms. And when we talk about the international transfers of major arms, according to SIPRI statistics, I have to always say a few words about how we get to this. The SIPRI statistical data on arms transfers relate to the actual delivery of major conventional arms. And this trend indicator value, which we have constructed at SIPRI, is an attempt to measure the volume of international transfers of arms using that common unit, the TIV, the trend indicator value. And the TIV is intended to represent the transfer of military resources. It's not about the financial value of the transfers. And we present the data preferably in percentage shares and percentage changes so that we can highlight the relative trends and patterns over time and between states. And we also tend to present this data in 5-year periods because deliveries of major arms can fluctuate very significantly year on year. And 5-year periods, we consider that a more stable measure of trends. So for the years which we talk about primarily today, it will be the periods 2013-2017 compared to the period 2018-2022. And as you can see on the slide, the arms transfers in the world increased up until the previous 5-year period. And then we see a slight decline in the most recent one. That is maybe somewhat surprising, but it's not a very big decline. Basically, we can say that the figure has remained very stable. But of course, within that overall figure, there are very great variations by states and in regions. If we look at the exporting side, we can see a few key trends, which I think we can discuss further in the Q&A. We see first and foremost that the US is, of course, the most dominant supplier of arms in the world, accounting for 40% in the previous 5-year period, and that after an increase of 14% between the two 5-year periods. And it is also useful to highlight that not only does the US account for that very large percentage, but the US has supplied major arms as far as SIPRI could identify in the past 5 years to over 100 states, which is much higher than any of the other major arms suppliers has as recipient states. Obviously, what is also very clear from the stats which I show behind me here is that Russia is still the second largest arms supplier in the world, but its arms exports have declined significantly over the past decade by 31%. And that is something which we believe at SIPRI is something which will continue also in the future, but more about that in a moment. Another case which we want to highlight is the rise of France as a major supplier of arms. It was always amongst the top 10, of course, but in the most recent years, it has grown up to the 3rd place and is now accounting for 11% of total world arms exports. And that's a significant change, as you can see, by 44% compared over the two 5-year periods. Other things can be highlighted here too, the rise of South Korea as a supplier, but for example, also the rise of Italy as a supplier. If we then look a little bit ahead as far as we can, and we're very careful about that because we believe that, of course, the future is very uncertain, and certainly when it comes to arms trade, things can happen very fast. Just this week, we had the announcement of the very major deal for submarines to be supplied by the US to Australia in the coming 10 years or so. And that's just one example of how things can change very fast. But if we look at the actual orders for major arms that are currently in place for the major arms exporting countries, we can see that the United States really continues to stand out. Just the number of combat aircraft, and we include everything from combat helicopters to combat aircraft to anti-submarine warfare aircraft in that particular category for this table. We can see that the United States accounts for so many more weapons on order than any of the other, or even all the other arms suppliers together. We can also see that the number of weapons that Russia has on order is actually not that high. Compare that to France or even to China or to Italy. That is a very low number, and that suggests that it is likely that also in the future Russian arms export will certainly not increase and potentially may decrease, while at the same time, French arms exports may increase or are slated to increase. They plan to increase over the coming 5 to 10 years. So we do see a certain shift there, and potentially even a shift in which France may come to an equal level or even higher in arms export than Russia. We then look at this recipient side, we see this picture. And the thing which stands out most is, of course, the surge in arms imports by European states. On the left-hand side, we see the two bars, and we can see that Europe accounted for 11%, and now it accounts for 16%. And that is, of course, very closely linked to the rapidly growing threat perception towards Russia, already starting especially in 2014, leading to deliveries in the past 5 years, and of course the massive military aid that Ukraine has received in 2022, but not necessarily before. This development is likely to continue because if we were looking at the number of orders for major arms in place by European states, and especially also the accelerated demand and orders for arms by a number of European states in 2022, and the large numbers involved in that, for example, the large numbers of tanks that Poland alone has ordered in 2022, we can really expect that the arms imports by Europe will continue to increase. But as we also can see on the picture, Europe is not the largest recipient region of arms, by far not. That is and remains Asia and Oceania. There's a slight decrease there, but of course, there are major differences between the sub-regions in Asia and Oceania. In particular, we can see, and we can move to the circle diagram on the right, we can see that Japan, South Korea, and of course very much also Australia are very important arms recipients in that region. And for each of them, we see that the imports have increased, and again, that there are major orders in place, not just those 3 Virginia submarines, which Australia just decided to acquire, but also many other primarily long-distance, long-range weapons, which those countries are acquiring in the light of what they perceive as a significant threat from China. The Middle East remains also high as an arms importing region, minor decrease, but that's not very much. And there we see, of course, a number of countries which are particularly important there. Saudi Arabia, the 2nd largest recipient in the world. Qatar is surprising 3rd largest recipient, surprising considering that it is a really small country and that 15 years ago it hardly had any armed forces at all. And of course, Egypt is there to be mentioned as a major recipient in that region too. And all that, of course, links closely to the concerns about how the weapons which are being supplied there are actually used in a number of conflicts, because it's alas not only in Ukraine we see those conflicts. And finally, maybe a few words about the rest of the world. In the Americas, in South America, we see a clear decline in arms imports. That region has a certain level of peacefulness, which allows states to stay away from the large type of arms acquisitions which they have been involved in the past. Although even there, for reasons which are sometimes hard to guess, states do continue to invest in significant arms procurement and therefore arms import projects. And finally, Africa, we see a steep decline. We shouldn't forget that's a region where conflicts are rife, and even if the arms transfers do increase, there are major questions about how the weapons are being used in conflict, whether it's in Mali or whether it's in Ethiopia. And of course, we also have to dig deeper in questions about how the arms transfer picture there has changed when it comes to the supplier-recipient relationships. For example, as in the case of Mali, where it was primarily Western states, France, Germany, the US, which were the main suppliers, but where now Mali instead has turned to Russia as a significant supplier. And that, of course, raises questions about how arms transfers are used as a major instrument for great power rivalry. I leave it at that. I hope there are many questions to delve into after this, and I give the word back to Rachel.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, I always find that such an indispensable resource. And I think this year there are some surprising finds. I mean, obviously, sometimes the data is a little lagged behind what is happening in real life. That's just the nature of data. But I'm wondering if you can sort of expand on this ranking of Qatar, because you mentioned that Ukraine, is obviously quite big, but when you look at your data, you see that Qatar is higher than Ukraine. Can you explain that to those of us who maybe are seeing this for the first or second time today?
Yeah, the thing with the expectation was, of course, that in 2022 in particular, the Ukraine would be by far the largest arms importing state. But the reality is that a lot what Ukraine has received are second-hand arms which come straight from the arsenals, the stocks that a country like the US or Germany or France or the UK have. So the value of those items can be, should be considered lower. And in addition, it is mainly about things like artillery, certain types of advanced, but still in terms of value, not so expensive or special, such as the HIMARS system. Yes, of course it is advanced, but it is not an F-15 or a Typhoon or a Rafale combat aircraft with everything on it. And that is exactly what a country like Qatar was allowed to receive. So that's the interesting discussion which you can have here. Whereas in the security policy, which includes arms transfers, in particular to Ukraine, there's on the one hand a willingness to supply arms, but on the other hand also a strong restriction or kind of a sense of the need to avoid escalation, avoid a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, which makes the donor countries hesitate to supply such advanced items such as combat aircraft and all the long-range missiles which belong to that and which would give Ukraine, in principle, the capability to attack Russia proper. Whereas in the case of Qatar, and for that matter also, as you can see on this list, countries like Saudi Arabia or India, which all have their conflicts, latent ones or open ones, such exports are allowed. And that raises some questions about how you can compare the different security policies and the role of arms transfers and the restraints in that, or the lack of that, in those specific cases.
Thanks. So I do want to ask you, there's many questions for you already in the chat, but I do want to ask one more just because I think it makes sense to do this right after you've presented. If you remove the Ukraine related numbers, do your exporters change? What is the share of exports? What does that look like?
The share of, so the exports to Ukraine were very substantial. And Ukraine was the third largest imported for 2022 alone. If we would take that away, yes, it would put a certain dent in it, but it's only, if you look at a 5-year periods, it's only a small percentage of the total. For now, at least. Of course, we will expect so many more transfers of arms, including of the type of more advanced arms, combat aircraft in particular, to Ukraine in the coming year or years. But for now, the impact is quite limited. And I think the bigger impact is and will be the fact that European states will arm up. Whatever the Ukraine will receive, what Poland will receive, at least what has been ordered until now, is significantly more than what Ukraine has received, or what is being planned to be sent to Ukraine at this point in time. And similarly, we can also look at what countries like Finland, Sweden, Germany, Norway, the Central European states, ranging from Czechia to Greece, they all have are in the process of very significant arms imports programs, and that is going to have the biggest impact on the international arms transfers, not necessarily what is being sent to Ukraine.
Thanks, Peter. There are many other questions. I have more questions, but I do want to give our other panelists an opportunity as well. And so I will encourage our participants, if you have additional questions, we will come back to Peter after we hear from Joe and Mary Lee. Joe, let me turn to you to put some of this data that Peter just presented in sort of a context and the trends that you're seeing, particularly in your reporting. What are people talking about? What do you see sort of looking back in the past year, but also what's to come?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. Obviously, the biggest link up here news-wise for us has been Ukraine's growth as an importer and U.S. weapons donations there since Russia's invasion roughly a year ago. Hopefully, I can offer something of a backdrop for some of the in-depth data and research that we just heard. One of the main themes in our coverage has been the push on to donate readily available arms to Ukraine from U.S. stockpiles, and how the Pentagon and the defense industry are tackling the issue of industry's production capacity. Obviously, Rachel, as you noted, we've seen something like $32 billion in military assistance sent to Ukraine, and that's really happened at a speed not seen before at the Pentagon. I don't think we associate speed with the processes for transferring arms from the U.S. government. But around this time last year, just as the effort to send the weapons was ramping up, companies were still emerging from pandemic-related labor and supply chain issues. The Pentagon in April had a meeting with representatives of the major American arms manufacturers just to feel them out. And at the same time, we were hearing experts warning that transfers of Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine were depleting U.S. stockpiles, and that the process of ramping up and replenishing them would take months and months. So that's one interesting theme. Another has been, Russia as the globe's number 2 arms exporter historically, and the way that sanctions from the U.S. and other countries could be eroding that position. By spring of last year, the Biden administration was openly talking about how it was using foreign military financing grants to allies to buy American military hardware, and that could possibly grab away some of the market share from Russia for the U.S. We were also seeing this idea of 3-way swaps with allies, where Eastern European nations were sending Ukraine their Soviet-era weapons, right, that Ukraine could use quickly in exchange for U.S.-made weapons later. So, this would have been clearing out legacy Russian fixed and rotary wing aviation, air defense, armor, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery systems, and we have seen in the U.S. aid packages to Ukraine for foreign military financing, I think on the order of about $2.2 billion in the aid package in September. So what about some of the other countries that are recipients of or have deals with Russia, like India? That's kind of an open question. I think we're still waiting to see. Actually, I plug? I saw that Stimson just posted an analysis of India-Russia relations that I still need to read. I'm doing that later. But what are countries looking for as they arm up? Pentagon officials have said that they're seeing global demand increase, both for new demand and to backfill supplies, integrated missile defenses, right? That's the kind of thing that we're seeing getting used in Ukraine. Early warning systems, ISR platforms. And the US clearly is not the only player here, right? The EU is working to incentivize deals between its own members. It's using a fund to promote purchases, right? They want to protect, they've, as Peter was mentioning, France is an emerging player. I think there's an interest within the EU also to keep that market share. So, Pentagon officials have been saying that they wanted to see an industry ramp up to accommodate all this demand. But what we've heard from defense firms, and they're saying this publicly, is that to be able to expand production, they wanted to see firm commitments from the government in the form of contracts, steady funding from Congress, investments in the supply chain. Lockheed Martin's CEO in I want to say early summer said that U.S. and allies were changing gears to arm up in response to Ukraine and in a more aggressive China, but the clutch wasn't engaged yet. So after the Pentagon was able to get its acquisitions chief confirmed, Bill LaPlante, he started holding meetings with national armaments directors from other allies to start talking about coordinating donations, something that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was already doing at sort of a different level in these monthly Ramstein meetings. In fact, I think they're having a virtual Ramstein meeting today, and typically those precede announcements of new donations. But one sign that the Pentagon is listening to industry is that it launched a Tiger team aimed at reforming the foreign military sales process. The industry has long complained that that process is too cumbersome. 8 or 9 months later, I don't know that we've seen any progress. And because the FMS process falls between state and DoD, it's the question of whether the White House has to step in. Anyway, another thing that we've seen another thing we're seeing as trend-wise, and Peter noted this in his data, is South Korea as an emerging player. They've really stepped aggressively into the market. In reported defense exports, in defense exports that it reported itself, it hit 15 billion by last October. That's more than double the year before. They've marketed themselves because they are focused on North Korea, that they're a manufacturer of land-focused weapons, which is the same kinds of things that are being used in the Russia-Ukraine war. But they're not the only, tanks, artillery, but they're not the only emerging player. We just had an interesting report that an Israeli company, Elbit, won several deals in Europe for truck-mounted howitzers that can fire NATO standard rounds. So it's going to really be interesting to see how this landscape changed, and with all of this demand, who kind of steps into the space, who captures it. South Korea has a co-production deal in Poland, and that might make its products even more attractive, right? If we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine war that logistics are important. Well, what if you have a hub manufacturing tanks right in Poland? If you're in Eastern Europe, a European country, maybe that becomes more attractive to you. Other things, other questions, other things we're watching. The Pentagon is talking about, Bill LaPlante is talking about interchangeability and production between allies, multi-country procurements. What does that mean? What kinds of co-production deals do we start to see? A lot of attention on munitions right now. Tons of munitions being expended in Ukraine. Congress granted the Pentagon multi-year procurement authority for a range of munitions to backfill stocks. The new Pentagon budget proposal, there's $30 billion for the sorts of munitions the Pentagon says it would need, not in Europe, but the Pacific. A third of it is long-range precision fires, multi-year purchases, maxing out production lines. To me, it sounds like that is the Pentagon responding to what industry was saying about the need for contracts, consistent demand. It's hard to say, or hard to get the Pentagon to say whether it's revised up its munition stockpile targets, right? Does it look at Ukraine, see the sheer numbers of munitions being expended and say, oh, in any future operations, in order to be ready, we need to raise our stockpiles. The Pentagon, it's kind of too tightly held, but NATO is saying openly that it's revising up its stockpile targets. NATO countries, I think, had not been even meeting their stockpile targets, but now there's a drive because of what's going on in Ukraine. Capitol Hill wise, we're watching the growing divide in the Republican Party over Ukraine aid, right? That's a big driver, is the politics in Washington, and how that plays out for Congress approving future aid. At the same time, another cross current, as you have lawmakers on a bipartisan basis pressuring the administration to send aid to Ukraine that it hasn't sent before. Longer range rockets like ATACMS, which is a rocket that gets fired from HIMARS. What about F-16 fighter jets? I just saw our colleagues at Politico have a report today that there was a bipartisan letter from senators to put pressure on the Pentagon to send F-16s. Anyway, I'll stop there and take your question. It's a lot to digest.
Thanks, Joe. I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned, sort of the politics of aid to Ukraine. Because I do think that, particularly, we have a very international audience today. They may not be aware that there is sort of a growing divide in this country about continuing to support Ukraine, which then goes back to sort of the data that Peter was presenting in terms of where we see those peaks and valleys in assistance to Ukraine. I wonder if you could just share a little bit on sort of the politics of assistance to Ukraine.
Sure. First I'll say that I feel like there's an interplay between what's happening. I didn't talk a lot about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, but we saw some major victories, I think, in the late summer. And it's my sense that I think the seeing Ukraine succeed with donated weapons, I think is something that kind of drives a narrative. They're making use. It's not for nothing that U.S. Equipment is being sent. And now, I wonder with this going on for longer than a year, we're seeing reports that maybe morale and success is potentially flagging. I mean, this is really being thought of as a pivotal time. What happens? Does that have an influence on support on Capitol Hill? And then at the same time, this divide in the Republican Party, the kind of the traditional Republican Party, the kind of Reaganite Republican Party that believes in more in kind of American intervention, embodied by somebody like the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who's been making speeches to say that U.S. national security is tied to stability and security in Europe. The road to peace is about surging weapons to Ukraine so that it can achieve victory as it defines victory. And that probably to some, reflects a majority within Republicans on Capitol Hill. But there are other more isolationist voices that have emerged in the Republican Party. And a really interesting, for one thing, we don't know, where exactly is the new House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. He's, I think maybe more traditionally, historically, in sort of the McConnell camp, but he's beholden to some of those other voices in the party. But the big development has been that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who's a presidential contender, just put out his views that stopping Russian aggression is not a vital interest of the, for the U.S. And he called this a territorial dispute, accused the administration of giving a blank check. Anyway, how does that play out? Is that a view that gets espoused more widely in the Republican Party? How does this play out? All those things are things that we're watching.
Thanks, Joe. I want to turn, because I think it was a nice segue of what you were describing in terms of the tensions between sort of the industry and the US government and other governments, frankly, to get the systems to where they need to be and replenish existing stockpiles. And so, Mary Lee, I'm wondering, we've seen this discussion in terms of the data and what sort of the realities are in terms of what's going from country X to country Y, or maybe stopping in between. We've talked about it a little bit in the context of world events and US politics, but I'm wondering if you can share some of the realities of the global arms trade on the defense industrial base, including things like supply chains. And obviously, we know you don't speak for all of industry, but you certainly have a unique perspective. So welcome your views.
Thank you, Rachel. And I want to express my deep gratitude to you and Stimson for having me today to talk on this esteemed panel. The SIPRI data is certainly embodying this notion that the U.S. is committed to strength and partnerships, and that it is pursuing to leverage what the U.S. sees as our greatest asset, which is our alliance and security partnerships. There are, as Joe was mentioning, there are a myriad of laws, policies, reviews that happen during the arms transfer process, but those specific details culminate into essentially a foreign policy decision, and one that is in pursuit of relationships. The U.S. has a legacy of being more of a partner that's more than just a capability. The U.S. government refers to this as a total package approach. It is sustainment, it is training. And as we begin to incorporate more emerging technologies and kind of next generation capabilities, it'll be things like security practices, resiliency in the system, and that translates into reliability. when this comes together and the decision is made, it's truly a mutual investment between the U.S. and the foreign partner on comprehensive deterrence. And that's a core component of our guiding national strategies, from the national defense strategy to the national security strategy to even the conventional arms transfer policy. And those deep-rooted relationships, translate into more focus, whether it be in the defense space or outside of the defense space, to the U.S. exporting its values. Focus on democratic values, human rights, institution building. So, I think we see in the SIPRI data that is living itself out. It's playing itself out around the globe. We do an annual, AIA does an annual assessment across industry to see kind of large facts and figures tied to the aerospace and defense industry. And we saw from 2021 to 2022 that the portion of the overall industry that's separate from civil aviation, commercial aerospace to that of defense has shifted. From 2021, it was separated for the industry to be about 80% civil commercial and about 20% defense. Into 2022, what we see now is an increase in the defense footprint. So we're looking at more of a 65% civil commercial market to now a 35% defense oriented market. So, it goes overall, and I think Joe has spoken to this, Peter has spoken to this, the demand is very high. The demand is high around the globe. And, that the SIPRI data is reinforcing that the US is producing capabilities and products that our global partners and allies are assessing are needed, to achieve their deterrence goals, to achieve their defense goals. From a US perspective, that demand is also comes with the notion that our US partners and our allies will be playing an outsized role in integrated deterrence, which the Pentagon and the Defense Department is in active pursuit of. So to your question about the landscape and how this is impacting the defense industrial base, I mean, this high demand is converging at one time on shared resources, whether that be from critical minerals, critical materials, to supply chains, to workforce. It's all coming together. And, the US has laid out its priorities. As Joe had mentioned, replenishment of US stocks and partner stocks that were provided to Ukraine in support of Ukraine is of utmost importance. And that's, been illustrated in the president's recent budget request. And before Ukraine, DoD and state, they operated in a peacetime setting and footing. And that is, goes back to how the arms transfer process is lengthy. It's very deliberative. It's relational oriented. It's foreign. It really is. And then since Ukraine, the U.S. government surged and did provide an historic amount of material through presidential drawdowns, U.S. inventory. And that was a monumental effort undertaken by the current U.S. government workforce. But the question now goes, how is shifting from giving things to Ukraine to selling things to Ukraine, and those are two different pathways. And so industry is encouraged by the president's budget request from the sense that it gives leeway, it gives flexibility in how the DoD, how the State Department, how the U.S. government will be able to approach, balancing all of these critical global security priorities. Joe had referenced multi-year buys, sustained support. Industry really relies on timely, stable funding, and that's in part because what is produced has long lead times. These capabilities are intricate, from whether research and development to production to delivery and then sustainment and beyond. These are long-term investments that require substantial infrastructure and a really expert workforce, which the industry is fortunate to have. And I think to kind of take that and flip it over to the global perspective, I think that's why we see some players like Korea, being able to find and carve out areas within the market to have a footing and to be able to supply globally because the demand is so high. There again, the infrastructure, it demands significant infrastructure, and Korea has been building that over a long period of time. And we're seeing that, other folks are looking at growing their defense industrial bases, primarily for what seems to be an interest in self-sustaining and self-sufficient defense. Taiwan just recently announced its intent to ramp up production of unmanned aerial vehicles, just given the demand that it sees for its security needs in the IS to have persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. And as opposed to purchasing that from other suppliers around the world, they're now looking at it as a need to have that built domestically. And this has been a kind of a trend. This growing of defense industrial bases domestically has been a trend that we've seen from the industry perspective and illuminated largely in industrial policies. So in a given transfer, in a given transfer, the foreign partner is looking for equivalent economic value to be built within in that country based on the transfer. And so you see that in things like Make in India, and we're seeing that kind of permeate across the globe to other partners outside of, including Europe and beyond. So, another example, I know France and Italy, that as Peter mentioned, their footprint is also fairly large in the arms transfer space, and they have legacies and have built, this over their footprints and their capacity over time. So, we don't foresee, industry is not foreseeing a waning in this accelerated pace. We have Ukraine that is continuing. Taiwan remains, as equal top priority for the U.S. in terms of national security. So, with that accelerated pace, the arms transfer system was established in a Cold War era, and so we continue to ask on the industry side and at the association whether that Cold War system will be sufficient for what are the current modern threats that we're seeing in such a dynamic environment. So, and as Joe had mentioned, we do see some of that energy. I think that question is being asked in the government as well, because we see some of that energy behind the Foreign Military Sales Tiger team.
Thanks, Mary Lee. I want to follow up on something that you mentioned about how you look at this data and how it reflects sort of the realities that you're experiencing. And I'm wondering if you can talk about when you look at sort of what you see in the defense industry and then what this SIPRI data demonstrates in terms of US export priorities, what that connection looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, layered underneath the data is a culmination of US foreign policy shifts. You see that with Ukraine, the spike of imports to Ukraine. You also see it with Turkey. We assessed since their procurement of the S-400 system, the SIPRI data shows a sharp decline. When you look at just the US to Turkey relationship from an export-import perspective. We had been analyzing some data that we received from the Commerce Department through the International Trade Administration, which is tracking HTS codes, harmonized tariff schedule codes. Those are more financial driven as opposed to SIPRI's approach, but they are also showed, interestingly enough, a sustain from 2018 to 2021, kind of a sustained volume, sustained number, but then a sharp decline, almost half, 50% into 2022. And that's reflective of the aerospace and defense, essentially that total package approach, this long lead time and from cradle to grave, long delivery schedule. But we're seeing that as it progresses into the future, that there is the relationship, the core relational components to arms transfers is living itself out in the data. Many of the transfers recorded in the given 5-year time frame for the SIPRI data really do reflect long-term commitments by the U.S. to its regional partners. So,
thanks. I'm going to open it up to the fuller Q&A now. I see we have several questions in the chat already. No surprise, Peter. There's a lot of questions about your data, which is great. And I want to pick on something that you mentioned in your comments about a decline in sort of Russian arms exports in 2022. Do you expect that trend to continue in the coming year? Sort of what are you expecting, looking at the sort of trajectory of the data over time? Where do you see Russian exports?
Yes, thanks. So we start there with the data which we have, as I showed, the orders which are currently in place for Russian arms, in particular for combat aircraft, for ships, for tanks. We see that those are relatively low compared to what several other major suppliers have in the books right now. And that in itself is an indication that there is a likelihood that Russian arms export may decline even further. That is partly also related to the fact that one major market is falling away, that is China. China is increasingly self-sufficient. It has in the past years received some items still. We suspect that it's primarily related to the Chinese desire to learn from Russian military technology, and less the desire to kind of integrate large numbers of Russian equipment into the Chinese armed forces, but also that, as it is now, looks to be coming to an end. One of the key examples here is that for a long time, China continued to import Russian engines for its combat aircraft and its bombers, and it appears that China now has come to a point where it most likely can produce its own designed, its own combat aircraft engines. And then so we see the Russian role in Chinese armaments dwindle further away. So that whole market seems to be disappearing there. And then the other important case is, of course, India, which has been the main market for Russian arms export market. And also there we see that India has looked increasingly at France for combat aircraft and submarines instead of from Russia, at the US for very advanced anti-submarine warfare aircraft to replace the old Russian types, and for example also at Israel for air defense systems. And so there Russia is losing terrain, and did that already before the invasion of Ukraine, or the renewed invasion, I should say, of Ukraine in 2022. But of course, the events in 2022 add further pressures on Russia, on the Russian arms exports, sanctions, which make it harder for Russia to be involved in international trade, financial flows, which don't really go any longer because the banks don't work, and things like that. And of course, also very important, the fact that in particular the US, but I think also European states have put significant pressure on major recipients of Russian arms to change their mind on that. And of course, the case of Egypt has been mentioned very often. Egypt, which had ordered in the past and was one of the major recipients of Russian arms over the past 5 years, but that was mainly up to 2020. Since then, almost nothing has been supplied as far as we can see. And one key deal for, I think, 24 very advanced Russian combat aircraft was cancelled. And instead, those will most likely go to Iran as it looks now. But the point is that it seems that Egypt has succumbed to the pressures of the US and has opted for other systems, French systems, and potentially also, again, then US systems. And similar dynamics we see also in a major market like in Indonesia, which has opted for French instead of Russian aircraft. And I think there are also a number of other examples which are either larger or maybe are more kind of at the starting phase. What we can see in the case of the US now actually supplying arms to Vietnam, which has also been one of the major recipients of Russian arms. So all these things together, yes, it seems as if Russian arms exports not only have been on the decline, but that decline may very well continue unless something very surprising and unexpected happens very soon. Yeah.
That's a really helpful perspective. And you mentioned China in your remarks and sort of the role of China as sort of evolving in their arms production and their capabilities, and even maybe providing sales to Russia or others in place of non-US sourced weapons and usually Russian weapons. So I wonder if any of our panelists can talk about, and maybe Peter, you're seeing this in the data already, what are the implications of sort of China's evolution as an arms producer, as well as taking over some of that market share from Russia, but also what could the impact in Ukraine be if China starts providing Russia with additional weapons that they're not able to produce themselves?
I'd be happy to bring in some of the key facts there. And one of the key facts, of course, that over the past 2 decades or so, we have definitely seen an increase in Chinese arms exports. But that increase was not continued over the past 5 years. Actually, we saw a decrease. And we also see that China has not been able to become a major supplier to at least one region where you would expect it to have significant chances to develop as such, and that is in the Middle East. Now, admittedly, I immediately say we may have missed some data there related to things like drones, but overall, we haven't seen any major sales of things like submarines or combat aircraft to Saudi Arabia or Qatar or any of the other larger recipients in the Middle East. We've even seen that Chinese exports to Egypt have decreased, and instead European states have become much more important there. So that shows that the expectations about Chinese arms exports, based on the rapidly developing, I'd say, quality and advancement of the products that they have on offer, haven't really come true yet. And of course, it's also important then to mention that a number of the largest arms export markets are simply not open for China. That includes obviously India, Japan, Korea, Australia, Europe, the US. So the possibilities for China to expand its arms export are limited to a much smaller group of countries for political reasons than it is for the US or for the Western European states, and even for Russia. And so the real increase in Chinese arms exports has taken place in Pakistan, which has been the most important recipient of Chinese arms since the 1960s.
And yeah, Rachel, I'll just jump in quickly to say that Russia and China announced their no limits partnership, but more recently, the Biden administration came out to say that the transfer of Chinese weapons to Russia would be unacceptable. So if that did happen, I think it'd be a major test for the Biden administration.
There are a lot of questions about South Korea. I think, Joe, you mentioned that the US may reach capacity, and so countries like South Korea can deliver weapons more quickly and may take a greater market share. There's a question about how has the emergence of new exporters such as South Korea or Turkey sort of affected US market share. I think, you know, the New York Times just had a great piece, I think it was over the weekend, about South Korea's sort of rising position in the arms production, manufacture, and export markets. So I think the eyes of the world are sort of how do other countries step up and fill some of the gaps that are going to naturally exist because of the need to replenish and resupply and just the growing demand. So I wonder, Peter, you may have seen some of these things already started playing out in the data, but Joe, you're obviously covering these stories, and Mary Lee, you're hearing the sort of chatter about this. So I wonder, I know that's like taking 3 questions and sort of mushing them together. So sorry to those who posed them, but they were linked enough that I wanted to just sort of talk about this notion of emerging new exporters. You know, they may have been second-tier exporters and they have designs on becoming top-tier exporters.
I'm happy to hop in there again, just to talk a little bit about the facts that we have about emerging suppliers. South Korea stands out there. It is the one country which has seen this enormous increase, and where we also expect, based specifically on the very significant orders that have been placed by Poland in the first place last year, and the UAE, smaller ones, and Egypt, also smaller, but potentially larger soon. So South Korea is there, just as it supplies cars and refrigerators. We can now also expect it to be a major supplier of arms. That is not necessarily so surprising. And maybe then it's important to say, but what about the others? Well, which other emerging suppliers really have succeeded in the same way? Well, not many of them. If you remember the list I showed, it's Italy and Spain. It is Israel, which has been there for a long time too. Once upon a time, that was a real emerging supplier too, but that's about 20 years ago. So that's one of the few others which really has succeeded in this market. Turkey is trying very hard. We know everything about the drones that have been used in Ukraine and elsewhere, for which there's an enormous demand. That is true. But how long will that really last? Will Turkey be able to sustain that in the competition with other states? Turkey's drones are relatively simple. They're not necessarily that expensive. They're not an enormous market share. And we can also wonder when others step in to take over, to kind of do what that one Turkish company has been successful in. And others may have much more capital behind them to be able to succeed in that. So when we talk emerging suppliers, South Korea, yes, for sure, but it hasn't reached the level of Italy or Germany. But the others, are they really going to play such an important role? Or maybe is their role much more to be part of that kind of international or multilateral or system of arms production, in which companies in Turkey or in South Africa or elsewhere may play a role in supplying components, parts, and maybe also some of the ammunition for which there's such a big demand, but not necessarily take such a big role as the real major players have and have been doing for a long time.
I can just jump in quickly to say that I think initially the Biden administration, maybe there's been a shift in the way that they talk about this. I think early on there was some, forward-leaning rhetoric about the U.S. taking over, Russian market share or resupplying allies. But I think maybe there's been a subtle change. Actually, Mary Lee kind of touched on this, is that there's an interest in having a healthy industrial base in Europe as well. The United States is a dominant player, but this kind of talk more recently about interchangeability, co-production. I think that there's probably some realization within the American government that you need your allies to be healthy as well, to have healthy industrial bases as well.
Yeah, and if I can add, Korea has really built its infrastructure in the defense space over time. It's been a long-term investment on their part. And with carving out this space that they now have in the market to help supply some of the land vehicles and things along those lines, they are essentially illustrating the physical world in which we live in, that the supply chains, resources that industry across the board can access to ramp up production, to meet capacity needs, are limited in nature. As Joe was saying, there is a recognition that the health of the industrial base becomes paramount when conflict then arises. But it will be interesting to see. I think, again, I had mentioned that there's a trend in domestic industrial policies to focus inwardly, in any transaction, there is a pursuit of equal economic value to be brought back to the partner nation who's purchasing. At least that's what U.S. industry is seeing. And it'll definitely be interesting to see how those policies will impact trade moving forward, because in general, that is maybe can close the business case, but maybe can't at the same time. So we'll see where that goes with more domestic centric defense industrial policies.
Thanks all. Continuing on that thread, there are a lot of questions about sort of specific kinds of weapon systems and sort of the trends of those weapon systems over time. So if you look right at the very beginning, Peter, you were talking about sort of the 5-year periods and looking at sort of the differences across the periods of data. So there does seem to be, as you mentioned, sort of a spike in 2022 as well as 2021, but one of the questions is about, is this due to, particular weapon systems? So you started with, there's a difference between, submarines and HIMARS, I think was the comparison that you made. Certainly when we're looking at tanks or armored vehicles or helicopters, you have different suppliers that really sort of have a greater market share than others in a certain weapon system. So are you able to sort of track those trends as well, to see where we might be able to indicate, emerging sort of larger market shares for different countries based on sort of demand that we're seeing across these 5-year periods?
I think that's a very difficult one to answer in a way, because you would need to have kind of the data ready to illustrate this a bit. But yes, it has been true, of course, that certain supplier countries are particularly strong in certain categories of arms. Germany, classic example, it's primarily, or has been primarily, naval equipment, ships, frigates, and many submarines. So it has really carved out a market there. There is competition because France can do that too, and you can see that the two are competing in the same market, whereas the US has been a bit outside that market. Then again, that's a little bit up until now, as we just saw, Australia is now going to receive nuclear-powered submarines, which is a major step for the US to take, and also the first time since, 50 years or so, that the US actually exports complete submarines, because there was no willingness to supply the only type of submarines, the ones with nuclear propulsion, which they had. So there's a bit of a shift there already. In other cases, a country like Italy has emerged as the 6th largest supplier now. Why is that? Well, it's oddly enough, it actually supplies weapons in all the categories that we see. Well, not really tanks, but armored vehicles to the US also. Ships, it's exporting combat aircraft. And the same we also see for South Korea. We talk a lot now about these big deals for tanks and artillery, but don't be mistaken, air defense systems, they're successful there too. And actually Poland has ordered a significant number of lighter combat aircraft. And South Korea is building its own new, more advanced, let's say F-16 roughly class combat aircraft, but then a little bit more advanced, you could argue, and has been marketing that abroad. And Indonesia is going to buy that, at least that's what they say. So I think it's extremely difficult to see this shift. But one of the things that the war in Ukraine has shown is that we shouldn't focus on single weapon types when we try to understand armament developments in the world. It's not just about drones or about artificial intelligence by itself. We should look at all the different weapons that have been used there. And it shows that warfare is about everything. And it also shows very clearly in the type of demand that we see in Europe and elsewhere. There is no single category that really stands out as being the one that is overwhelming in the numbers that are included. The only thing I can say that, at least in SIPRI figures, it is generally the combat aircraft and everything that comes with it, which have the highest value. And I think that's also reflected if you would look at the arms procurement budgets and how they are divided over the different categories in state. That is still air power remains the backbone of the armed forces throughout the world, even if the case with Ukraine in that case has been somewhat confusing, as air power has played a much smaller role than everyone would have expected there. But I think we can probably agree that that's an exception.
That might have been a complicated question, Peter, but you did an incredible job sort of giving us actual examples, but also leading to other questions that we're seeing. I mean, I think you're right. SIPRI's data is focusing on these larger, the value of systems, but there are several questions about what about some of the systems that are sort of not the sexy, big ticket items that are in the news. So there are questions about obviously risks and data regarding illicit transfers of arms, which I know your database is not covering, but certainly something that we can talk about as a group. But also what arms smuggling looks like in light of these current trends that we are seeing. So, where obviously we've talked at Stimson events, but sort of the community has talked about risks of all of these weapons going to Ukraine and sort of what happens when the conflict ends. Obviously, we're not seeing significant illicit smuggling today because those weapons are still in very high demand. But there is a long track record, not just in Ukraine, but in post-conflict situations when the tensions die down, those weapons that are more likely to be smuggled, small arms and light weapons, some of the missiles, missile launchers, et cetera, that can be easily moved across borders. Those are the kinds of things that we're seeing. So I guess the question sort of for all of you is, what are you sort of seeing, hearing? What are the issues of concern with regards to this influx, this unprecedented amount of weapons that is not only just going to Ukraine, but the global demand and what that could do for the illicit market? Joe, I see you've already got your microphone off.
Yeah, actually, I was just I was just remembering that you and I talked about this like just a couple months ago, that the State Department has has come out with some like a broad outline of what its plans are to avoid weapons diversions. The Defense Criminal Investigative Service has also talked to us about how they're leaning in and making their presence known. I think that in the most recent appearance on Capitol Hill, the DOD and Inspector General, I don't think I want to say he didn't say that there hadn't been diversions. I think he was saying that they'd had some open investigations. So maybe a shift from when we were hearing, no, it's there hadn't been any. But I mean, this goes back to the political question too. I think if there was a Republicans leading committees, oversight committees, I think they've endeavored to try to delve into all of the oversight measures that the U.S. government has going to monitor these transfers, because if to kind of counteract the narrative that that these weapons are being sent like willy-nilly, there's this blank check, who knows what's happening to them, are they really being used effectively? they've tried to kind of get ahead of that to shore up some of the political support. Anyway, I'll end there.
If I could add, Rachel, the everyone's favorite topic, excuse me, export controls. Industry is seen, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, particularly on the dual use side, export controls and then compliance and enforcement actions out of the Department of Commerce have increased substantially. You know, they have sent a very clear message to industry that this is a priority. You need to ensure your compliance with the regulations, and you know, they've kind of backed that up with, now there is a task force on disruptive technologies. We're seeing a partnership with the Office of Export Enforcement at Commerce and the Department of Justice that was not there before February of last year. So, you know, I think in terms of from an industry perspective, the message has been very clearly sent that the, you know, compliance is key, and compliance is a priority of this administration and of the government at this point for all exports or transfers of equipment going either to support Ukraine or generally speaking.
Thank you. There's several questions. I mean, it's interesting to me when I saw that so many questions popped up on this. We really haven't talked about an entire continent, and that's Africa. We talked a little bit about the Middle East, North Africa, but we really haven't. You mentioned a little bit, Peter, in your comments about Latin America, but sort of the minor role that they're playing, and they're relatively at peace. But we know that there are many conflicts sort of emerging and percolating throughout the African continent. We also know that there are competitions for influence in Africa. It is sort of a very you know, battleground, so to speak, a nonviolent battleground between the US and China for influence in many of those countries, sometimes violent, of course. But I'm wondering if there's sort of any thoughts both on Africa, but also which countries not only are making the plays for a bigger role in Africa in terms of providing weapons, but also which countries on the African side are having a greater demand for weapons from some of these suppliers.
Maybe I can start to chip in there. And I'm saying immediately that we haven't had the chance at SIPRI to look much closer at the African angle of things to understand how arms deliveries play a particular role in that great and also not so great power rivalry that we see there. But I think, and one of the problems there is, of course, that the data that we have, as it is mainly about major arms, doesn't necessarily give the kind of detailed information that you need to understand arms flows and armament dynamics in especially sub-Saharan Africa. In North Africa, it's another thing that we can talk about, the tensions between Morocco and Algeria, which already over a long time have driven the arms procurement by both states, where both states also have, at least for the time being, chosen clearly for certain types of suppliers, Morocco primarily being aimed at the US and at Western European suppliers, and Algeria having turned more to Russia and to China, but for that matter also to Germany and Italy. But that's less about great power competition there. The concern there is maybe more related to the Mediterranean, where we see that several states are building up their naval forces and do that, of course, with the support from the arms suppliers elsewhere. And that leads to questions to how such an armament dynamic could fuel further tensions and potentially even conflict. And then I'll talk about supplies to Greece, to Turkey, to Israel, to Egypt in particular, and how these kind of and to Cyprus and how several players there have chosen to supply arms, partly for economic reasons, partly for political reasons, but how this the issue is here: how can you build a sound security policy for the region where you include arms transfers, and how can you be sure that you still can, let's say, control the way such arms are being used? So that's that part of Africa and a bit more. But sub-Saharan Africa, I think that there is an important debate to be had about how the competition between the major powers is shaping arms flows to that region, and how this also has led to the use of arms in very irresponsible ways. We can think particularly on about what happens in Ethiopia, which is, in terms of casualties, actually a bigger war than Ukraine has been until now. And there we see that the European states and the US have pulled out already for a long time, and it has been primarily countries like China, probably Russia, probably Turkey, maybe Iran, which have played a role there. But the data is very uncertain. The quantities we don't really know, and exactly what the objectives are of the suppliers also remains very unclear. And similar stories evolve in Mali, Burkina Faso, and other parts of the region. But again, this is for us a terrain which we want to explore a lot more, and that's why I leave it with these short remarks.
Thank you. We are running short of time. There's a specific question for Mary Lee in the Q&A, so I want to ask that one about sort of where there's a new conventional arms transfer policy, for those who have not heard, in the United States, which is sort of the framework document that outlines sort of the US approach to conventional arms transfers. We had a great event with 2 Deputy Assistant Secretaries last week at Stimson with industry and civil society views as well. I encourage you to go back and watch that if you have not. But it is sort of a big deal in the United States in terms of a new approach, a new framework for arms sales coming out of the previous administration. And one of the elements there is supporting the defense industry to export arms to new markets. And so I'm wondering, and maybe Joe, you've seen some of this also in your reporting, about what regions and sub-regions of the world do you see the aerospace industry specifically looking to target? Peter gave all of this data about sort of US dominance around the world. So what's left, I guess, and do you see sort of the technology transfers and domestic production impacting aerospace market shares in any way?
Well, that is a great question. I think that, given, again, going back to kind of the physical world in which we live, the DoD has set, and in coordination with the State Department, have set priorities, which the defense industrial base will naturally respond to. We see that increase in demand for NATO partners and NATO allies. The announcement of the Australia, UK, US agreement, AUKUS, for nuclear powered submarines sends a demand signal. But, again, we go back to the translation of those demand signals beyond just the policy elements, but into the actual where rubber meets the road on contracting. So I think, there is significant work to be done across the globe to manage these security priorities. Aerospace is a global industry. There are areas where this notion of deep-rooted partnerships that the US typically pursues in defense space, I think will guide again some of the defense industrial base resources. We see Europe, Eastern Europe, the demand is already there, but the DoD is pivoting to the Indo-Pacific. Pivoting to the Indo-Pacific will require creative approaches truly to meet the needs that both the US has, but also that our partners and allies have in that region. It's a completely different landscape. It's very maritime heavy, very maritime dominated. So those I think beyond what is the current conflict in Eastern Europe, there's this focus then on the Indo-Pacific region. But I would not want to discount or discredit other areas of the world where we know those relationships are critical, and I would look to Latin America for that. There is infrastructure that exists in Brazil and et cetera. So, Mexico, we see there are emerging markets there, given the infrastructure, which is incredibly important for aerospace products, that there's already residual infrastructure there. So hopefully that helps and answers that question.
So you mentioned Indo-Pacific. We have 5 minutes left. And so I want to give, rather than there's a lot of questions left, and I apologize. It's always a sign of a good event, though, when you can't get to all the questions because people are clearly engaged and interested. So I want to give each of our panelists sort of a last opportunity to either answer things they've seen in the questions or just some point that you weren't able to raise in your remarks or in the questions so far. So maybe I'll put Mary Lee back on the spot. We'll just go in reverse order from where we started, and I'll start with you, Mary Lee.
Well, again, I just want to say thank you so much for having me today. It's been an illuminating and robust conversation. So I am very greatly appreciative of being a part of it. I would only make one other comment on modernization. And that is the modernization of the system. I mean, we're in a really exciting time where we can move beyond what was the historic approach to arms transfers into a, maybe refreshed isn't the right word, but this modernized approach to how we interact globally in security ways and security capacities. We talked about the constraints on supply chains, the constraints on resources, and that is almost driving a little bit of how do we think about this differently? How do we, we may need a new way of thinking about how the U.S. engages in arms transfers and really equips our partners and allies, as well as our U.S. military with the right capabilities to ensure peace and prosperity. So, on a consistent basis, seeing U.S. strategic priorities in the decision-making process for arms transfers, and then, the relational aspects remain key, and that there were those concerns about diversion and illicit use of arms. We're moving into an era where technology and emerging technologies can play a really key role in assurance of those things. So, again, I think this administration and the president has used the phrase inflection point, and I see that tied as well to maybe there are areas in which this system could be modernized to meet some of these really dynamic, rapidly evolving geopolitical threats. So, and the landscape.
Thank you. Joe, over to you.
Just I would build on points that Peter and Mary Lee have made about the Indo-Pacific. We've seen a number of force posture moves as the Pentagon is looking to build up alliances. So I think as part of that, they want to build up partner capacity. So deals with the Philippines for base access. There's some fairly widely publicized purchases that Japan is going to make. Australia is going to be buying Virginia-class submarines in the 2030s on its way up to its having its own capability in the 2040s. So I would just build on that and say, let's, if there's a place where we're going to see future action, I would say Indo-Pacific. Oh, and thanks for having me. This has been great.
Always a pleasure, Joe. Peter, over to you.
Yeah, we are going to see a place for action. It will be most of the world. And that maybe also brings me to saying that this has been an overwhelming year for your average arms transfer expert / peace researcher. And one of the things which is striking, of course, is that when we look at Ukraine alone, how so many mistakes have been made in the assessment of what could happen there. The mistakes that have been made in the assessment of the intentions and the willingness of the Russian regime to actually attack Ukraine. And at the same time, the misjudgments of the actual military capability of Russia, by Russia itself, and arguably also by the rest of the world. And the misjudgment of maybe not having supplied Ukraine with weapons before, which could probably have stopped a lot. If it would have been able to deter Russia, we would have been in a very different world right now, presumably. But that's all things which have happened. But then one of the things which then develops from that is that sense of urgency, that sense of now we must arm up. But at the same time, that raises then the question of, well, where's the restraint? Where's the arms control? Where's the thorough thinking about, should we really start to buy everything we need or we think we need, but on the basis of which assessment? What is it really that the threat is, at least in Europe? Is it really so that Russia is able to use force at this point in time against anyone else than Ukraine, and even there it falters? Do we have that need for speed here? Do we need to acquire all those arms now? Do we have to live up to the requests from the industry to place orders now so that they're not lagging behind? These are very important questions, which I think we have to look at very closely, and we have to very clearly think about how arms procurement processes are shaped, and that we don't lose out of sight that making the right decision about what to acquire and how to use the resources we have in the best way is essential. And maybe there are other areas where we have to spend more than on combat aircraft. Maybe it's the attempts to shore up energy independence, or maybe it is attempts to work on tools that can prevent Russia from having political influence that play a bigger role. And so that's a bit what I see when I see this urge for arms in Europe or elsewhere. When Australia buys nuclear-powered submarines, then I constantly want to take that step back and say, but shouldn't we slow down, and how can we find ways to actually go back to the table wherever it can be done to discuss arms control?
Thanks, Peter. I think you raised some really important questions and points about, we're focusing today on the actual arms trade itself, but there are alternatives in diplomacy and foreign policy that hopefully reduce the demand and reduce the conflicts that we're seeing around the world. We will talk about those ideas and issues at future Stimson events, to be sure. Thank you to our audience for indulging us a few extra minutes. I really want to thank our panelists for a really informative and exciting discussion. I think we'll all be watching really carefully in the next year to see what trends emerge. And then a year from now, we'll be back on this stage, maybe even in person again, to see sort of how world events have shaped the arms trade. I really want to offer a heartfelt thank you to our speakers for joining us today, particularly SIPRI and Peter, who partner with us and trust us each year to do this event and to discuss this data, which is really, for people who work on these issues every single day, it's really, I said it at the beginning, it's an indispensable resource and one that we're really grateful for. Thank you to our very engaged audience, and reminding everyone that a recording of this event is available. So if you came in late or you had to leave a little bit early, you can find this immediately on our website, share it with your networks. And I really want to encourage you all to attend an upcoming event on March 30th, where we're going to be discussing U.S. arms transfers in the context of the very common refrain, if we don't sell, someone else will, and what that really means and what Arms for Influence actually looks like. So you can find information about that event and all Stimson events on our website at www.stimson.org. Thank you again for joining us today, and wishing you a wonderful rest